Hi, everyone. It's Rabbi Noah Farkas from Valley Best Shalom, and welcome to the Sunday Schmooze. I'm joined with my good friend, Chloe Valdary, who is an amazing writer and speaker, and she is the founder of this wonderful organization called The Theory of Enchantment. And her writings have appeared in some of the most important publications across America, including the New York Times. Chloe, welcome. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Noah.
How are you?
I'm hanging in there, holding down the fort, as they
Yeah.
say.
And you're living in New York, right?
Yep, I live in Brooklyn in
Yeah. So
Bed-Stuy.
how's that going right now?
It's interesting. There have been protests every day for the past week. I'm planning on going to the protests this evening. So I'm having various conversations with folks in my community, for example, from my hairstylist, we talk about, these things, to with my roommates. My roommate, Zach, has been going to the protests every day this week, actually, for the most part. So lots of interesting conversations, lots of dialoguing, lots of observing Twitter as well, because I think social media has actually, the importance and the influence of social media has been amplified right now because of what's happening with the protests against police brutality, what's happening with COVID-19. It's just, there are more eyes, on social media and online in general. So.
Well, we'll get into all that, I think, today. Maybe just take a step back.
Sure.
And I know a lot about you, but tell me about Theory of Enchantment, how you got into it, where it comes from, what your passions are.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm from New Orleans originally, and I grew up in a very atypical Christian family. Atypical in the sense that it was very similar to Seventh-day Adventists. So we went to church on Saturday, not Sunday. The church that I attended also observed the holy days, the Jewish holy days, so Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and also did not eat quote unquote unclean foods. So I grew up kosher style, so I don't eat pork or shellfish. So as you can imagine, in New Orleans.
Shellfish is a vegetable in New Orleans. I don't know.
That's what some people say. So that's how I grew up, and it was a cultural thing, in addition to being a religious thing. And so I naturally developed an affinity for Jewish culture and for Jewish identity, and I identified with the Jewish people, even though I'm not Jewish, because when all of my Jewish friends in school were out for the day for Rosh Hashanah, so was I, right? So it was something that connected us together. And so because of this, I developed a huge cultural affinity for the Jewish people and got involved in college in pro-Israel activism. In college, I did Israel activism for 3.5 years, and then I did it again. I did it for like 8 years in total, so 5 years afterwards. Worked for a Jewish nonprofit called Jerusalem U for 2 years. Worked at the Wall Street Journal for 1 year. And I'm telling you this background story because Theory of Enchantment comes in part from my desire to create a framework that could inspire people on the college campus who are having very difficult conversations, very heated conversations, and in some cases very mean-spirited conversations about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to change and to be inspired to become their better selves, their higher selves, and to approach one another in a spirit of love and compassion instead of in a spirit of hostility and animosity, to see each other first and foremost as human beings made in the image of the divine. That was really my goal in creating Theory of Enchantment, and it was in part informed by that. And when I was at the Wall Street Journal for 8 months, I worked on a thesis paper that ended up being the catalyst for Theory of Enchantment. And so the purpose of the thesis paper was to ask this question: if I could create a framework to teach people how to love, to teach people how to become enchanted with each other. And the way in which I answered this question was by saying, okay, if I want to know how to get people how to love, I have to ask, what are people already in love with? And is there a pattern that can be discovered across the things that people are in love with? And so at that point, I started to study pop culture, because pop culture is like everything that we gravitate toward as a culture. I started studying companies like Nike. I started studying influencers like Beyonce, companies like Disney, to see if there was a common theme across the way in which they essentially sold their brand to us as consumers. And the theme was very simple. They created content in which their audience saw themselves and their potential reflected in the content. And that was it. And that's why we bought it. That's why we bought Nike, because we thought that we could, by putting on this tennis shoe, by wearing this hat, just do it, right? We could overcome any obstacle. We could maximize our potential. We could achieve anything. Very similarly, when Beyonce says, "Who run the world? Girls." Many women see themselves and their potential reflected in that content, which is why we gravitate toward her. Same for Disney. Every single Disney movie is a motif for the human condition, and is a story about a hero who has to face and ultimately overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles in their way. So I wrote this paper, I wrote this thesis, and then I worked for Jerusalem U for 2 years, as I said, but the majority of my time spent when working there was spent speaking on college campuses and refining this idea of enchantment. And so I, in the process, developed a set of principles that animate the theory of enchantment, and that I lectured on. And those principles are: treat people like human beings, not like political abstractions; criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy; root everything you do in love and compassion. And so I lectured on that on many, many college campuses, not only here, but also in Europe, for 2 years. And increasingly, I got people coming up to me and saying, this is not just relevant for international studies. It's not just relevant for international conflict. It's relevant for human beings in general. It's relevant for interpersonal conflict. And it's relevant for the process of building character, which is a worthwhile project. And so enough people told me that eventually I said to myself, okay, so I guess I should probably take this and run with it. So I decided to formally create Theory of Enchantment startup. And now Theory of Enchantment is a full 25 lesson course based upon those 3 principles that teaches students how to understand the self, how to have a healthy relationship with themselves so that they can then have a healthy relationship with others, and how to root everything they do in love and compassion. And as you can imagine, because part of what inspires me with regard to this project is pop culture, there's a great deal of pop culture in the course. So it's culturally resonant, it's culturally relevant. It takes the work of Kendrick Lamar and juxtaposes it next to the work of Dr. King. It takes the work of John Mayer and even juxtaposes it next to James Baldwin. So there's a lot of richness to it. And I'm really, really, really proud of how it's turned out, and really hopeful for how I think it will inspire a lot of people, especially in these trying times.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting because it's totally interesting and fascinating, because what you're basically saying is, we've talked about this before, is that, like, if I get this right, that one of the dangers that we have is both to, like, flatten the face of another person, like to flatten their personhood into just almost like a paper doll version of who they are.
Yep.
And then also, like, it's even okay to rage.
Yeah.
You have to focus that rage in a way that will construct a better world, not just tear the world down, right?
Yes,
Am I getting that right?
Yes, absolutely. I think, when you talked about, not flattening people, I thought of, there's a quote from Ralph Ellison in his book Shadow and Act, where he says, when you reduce and stereotype others, you actually reduce and stereotype yourself. And I don't think people are cognizant of that when they do that to other people. But simultaneously, yes, rage can be a beautiful and healthy and powerful agent for social change. I would say Dr. King embarked upon a very holy form of rage, right? Which is why what he did was so self-sustaining, and why what he did was so holistic. And people unfortunately don't necessarily think of rage as something that can be channeled in a positive direction, and can be controlled, right? And and can be really done in a healthy and a positive and a holy way. And that's really, I think, what needs to happen right now.
Mm. Yeah, I'm getting there's a lot of mixed feelings
Mm-hmm.
in at least the Jewish community, and I'm sure in the American community, especially the white community,
Sure.
about what we're seeing unfold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's clear George Floyd murdered by cops,
Yep.
right? And in some ways aided and abetted by bystanders
Yep.
who didn't stop them, right? Didn't at least confront them, didn't stop
Right.
them, right? Um, so and it's like just so shocking when you see the image of George on the ground
Mm-hmm.
suffering and the refusal of the officer to even look him in the face.
Yeah.
Like it's a classic example of your first principle,
Yeah.
right?
Right there. Right
You-
there. You violated the first principle.
So then there's a lot of rage that comes from that.
Right.
But the mixed feelings comes in on all sorts of different levels, and pundits will use this for all sorts of different purposes. But the looting, crime,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get the sort of, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this,
Mm-hmm.
attacking George Floyd's character, attacking Black Lives Matter because they're not supposedly dealing with stuff happening inside the Black community,
Mm-hmm.
and in the Jewish community specifically, because part of the movement for Black Lives Manifesto includes aligning themselves with the BDS movement, that
Mm-hmm.
somehow that just makes the whole thing not kosher
Sure.
for Jews to involve. And so help me complicate this in a way that feels productive.
All of that.
You know what? For the sake of this, just pick one. Pick one thing that, because I think that, I mean, as you're using theory enchantment, this
Yeah.
empowerable social emotional learning piece, I think this is a moment where it could really shine, right?
So I'm going to address the issue of Black Lives Matter, I think. And this very visceral and understandable hesitation on the part of some in the Jewish community to disassociate with the at least the national organization. Now it's sort of confusing, or sort of misses the point, because there are individual Black Lives Matter chapters that have nothing to do with the national organization. Even within the national organization, it's unclear that there is actual organization, right? So it's hard sometimes to parse out, who you're addressing and what you're addressing. But I would say that I think that if one agrees with the term Black Lives Matter, then that is the only thing that really should matter in this case. Meaning, if someone who identifies with BLM wants to go off and spew rhetoric about BDS, I think that we have to have the discernment and the power to ignore them, and to continue, and to not let ourselves be sidetracked by people who would exploit this moment in order to tear apart two communities that need each other right now. And so I think we just have to have enough foresight to be able to do that, to be able to hold two things at once. Number one, I acknowledge the necessity of being in solidarity with the Black community when it comes to police brutality, and I believe in the principle of Black Lives Matter, and I also recognize that I have this problem, this challenge to Black Lives Matter on a national level when it comes to its Israel stance. Hold both of those things at once. It's okay that those things are in tension. Human beings are incredibly sophisticated beings, and we're capable of holding things in tension at the same time. It's actually very scary and hard to do it the first time you do it. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. But I think we are capable, we are mature enough. We have to be spiritually mature enough to be able to hold those two things at once, and apply the three principles across the board to whomever you're speaking, whoever they represent. Apply the principles. Treat each other like human beings, not political abstractions. If you want to criticize this stance, criticize it to make Black Lives Matter better, a better organization, better for the community, better for community relationships. So I would say that, one's very legitimate heartbreak over the fact that BLM included the BDS movement in its platform should inspire a person to get involved with Black Lives Matter. It shouldn't inspire a person to say, well, screw you, you neglected me, now I'm going to neglect you, right? That cannot be our spiraling down process that we engage in.
Right. So when you say inspire them to be more involved with Black Lives Matter, is that coming from like a relational place where you're like let's say I'm a white Jewish man who's a Zionist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And firmly believes that BDS is a detrimental and actually seeks to end the state of Israel as opposed to just try to correct the state of Israel's strategic mistakes, et cetera.
Yep.
So, in that case, I feel that BDS can easily and often is rooted in anti-Semitism and wants to destroy the state of Israel. And then I see an organization like Black Lives Matter of people who I know and I cherish as human beings are involved with it. So are you saying that I should be inspired to be more involved because it's the relationship I develop with another human being, in this case, an African-American pastor or an activist or what have you, so that they would hopefully see me as a human being and that they would
100%.
see our personhood and the idea that I'm a Zionist and care about the state of Israel?
100%. And so then what ends up happening in the long term is that when people stereotype and reduce Zionists to the negative stereotypes that Zionists are often reduced to, it will not work, because now you have developed a real thriving human relationship that makes obvious the complexity of what it means to be a Zionist. And so the rhetoric and the propaganda falls flat because you have developed the necessary relationship, which is deeper and more rooted than these slogans. I was in a debate once with Mark Lamont Hill and various others who are supporters of BDS a couple years ago. It was a very difficult event for me. And the reason why it was a very difficult event for me was because the majority of the people in that audience, like to me, it seemed, were just seething in hatred. Now, this was an audience that my impression was had been very disenfranchised and very many of them were the working poor. And so there are obviously other issues that have nothing to do with Israel and nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that were fueling a lot of the bitterness and a lot of the hatred that I saw. And I said to my friend, our friend Amanda, I said to Amanda, I said, I would never in a million years wish for any Ashkenazi Jew to be on this stage and to be on this platform to debate the pro-Israel argument, because the people in this audience are full of hatred and they have to heal. That has to happen. But that was something that I experienced, and it was visceral. It was visceral. And the one thing that I said, the one point that I kept saying, this goes back to your point about developing relationships with people. I said, the problem with BDS lies in its rejection and its refusal to acknowledge that the Israeli also has experienced trauma, that the Israeli also has experienced pain, that the Israeli also has experienced great sorrow. And it is the absolute callous dismissiveness of that and the absolute refusal to acknowledge and grapple with that so that there can be a better, deeper, more holistic relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. I said, as long as you refuse to do this, you will be seething in the hatred that you are seething in. And that's quite frankly exhausting. I said to you at the beginning of this call, I am reminded of Kendrick Lamar's great quote from Poetic Justice: a fatal attraction is common, and what we have common is pain. There's so much wisdom in that line, and that needs to be I think a launching off period for a lot of the conversations that we're having between communities in this country, between communities and the police in this country, and obviously also on an international level as well.
So just to bring it back from the Israel-Palestine conversation, because I mean, you and I talk about that all the
All
time.
the time, yeah.
But let's bring it back to America and think
Mm-hmm.
about, right? So one of the sort of places where we start to wander back into this neighborhood is that here in LA, there were a series of Jewish businesses and synagogues, et cetera, on that Saturday night, that very first,
Okay.
most visceral night of looting, that were
Mm-hmm.
looted, ransacked, destroyed, burnt in some cases. And there are some Zionist organizations who are trying to say that it was essentially a pogrom. They use the word
Mm.
pogrom in that. So, I don't want to put you on the spot, but help me contextualize this, because there
Sure.
are folks who are, again, traveling down this rage road, traveling down this road of flattening the other. How do we, help me, how do I figure out how to deal with that truth
Mm-hmm.
that these terrible things happen, specifically in the Fairfax neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and deal with the truth that there's just a lot of pain in the African American, but really people of color and people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder, because that this is I think is not just a race protest. I think a
Yeah.
lot of it's a bread protest, and I think that there's a whole lot of poverty issues being expressed here too, of which racism is a major part. So just help me address that as we
Mm-hmm.
begin to bring it now back to specifically this moment in where we are right now.
So there's a great quote from Michael Jordan for Air Jordan ad that was advertised a couple years ago, and he says, "Look in my eyes. I know that you're afraid. I know that you're scared. You're scared of what I could become. I'm scared of what I won't become." And it seems to me that that psychological dynamic between individuals, between groups of communities that are strangers to each other, is what is at play in a lot of these moments that we're living through right now. So, for example, a cop encounters a young black kid, and a young black kid encounters a cop. Now, I don't know, I'm setting the scene, I don't know the lived experiences of this young black kid. I don't know the lived experiences of this cop. I could make up a hypothetical that could seem realistic, though, to illustrate the point. This kid could, be coming home from school, and let's say he's on his way to go play basketball. He doesn't want to be bothered. He's just on his way to go play basketball. He's tired of the cops stopping him just because he looks a certain way to go play basketball, right? He's not doing anyone any harm. He's minding his business. He comes from, let's say, a somewhat poor family, single mother in the home. He's in school, and this is what's happening in this particular situation. So that's the extent of the what will I call it, baggage that he's carrying in that moment.
Yeah.
Now let's do the police officer. The police officer, maybe, I don't know, just yesterday saw a murder, or had to go to a domestic abuse situation, let's say. He saw things that would make any person cower and potentially have PTSD, right? And he's not getting treatment for his PTSD, because we don't do that in this country. He's not getting treatment for his PTSD. So he is coming into the situation with a certain perception of the other because of his experiences. And this kid is also coming into the situation with a perception of the other because of his experiences. And no one is stopping. No one is coming in between them and saying, let us try to engage in an exercise where we understand that we are experiencing the exact same reality, but from different perspectives. That's something that Jay-Z talks about in his book, his autobiography, Decoded. Having the exact same reality, but through different perspectives. And when Michael Jordan said, "You're afraid of what I could become, I'm afraid of what I won't become," in that moment, these two individuals are having the exact same thoughts about one another, which is insane to think about, because it, on the one hand, illustrates how incredibly interconnected we truly are, how incredibly similar and alike we truly are, but at the same time, it represents a stark tragedy because no one knows this. No one knows it, and no one's telling anyone this, right? And so in this case where I could imagine, I could be generous and imagine a protester who has descended into nihilistic rage, knowing nothing about the complexity and the depth of the community, of the Jewish community that they're attacking, going out and doing the deed that you described, and reducing that community and stereotyping that community to a figment of his or her imagination. But when you do that, inevitably, there is this saying that Michael Jordan said, "You're afraid of what I could become, I'm afraid of what I won't become." And then, unfortunately, it informs a cycle, because now there are people in the community that are attacked, looking at this person who did that and stereotyping and reducing that person. And so then the cycle just continues and continues and continues until someone or some people or some group or some community decides to speak to a prophetic vision that calls people to their higher selves and causes people to do better and causes people to realize the presence of the divine image within every single one of them. First they have to recognize that it exists within themselves, and then they can begin to recognize that it exists within the other, not as a throwaway line, just like frivolously quoting the Bible, but taking it seriously until we have that spiritual richness in this country, which is why I think we need the pastors and the rabbis so much at this moment. Until we have that, we will see the descent into despair and nihilism. Because if you don't think that you are worth fighting for, and I do believe that a lot of this comes down to lack of self-worth. If you don't think that you are worth fighting for, why would you think that anyone else is worth fighting for? And so it's very controversial in some circles for me to say, we have to ask, what does the Black community need in this moment in general, right? We also have to be brave enough to ask, what are these cops going through? What's going on? What's the breakdown?
Right.
Something's happening psychologically, spiritually. What's going on? And we need to fix it. But in order to do that, I have to have enough love for myself that having love for someone else who may be even oppressive is not an affront to my sense of identity. It's not a threat to my sense of identity, because I'm sorry to keep quoting pop culture, but there's a great song by Drake where the female vocalist, whose name I forget, says, "I love me enough for the both of us. You give, but you cannot take love."
So just a couple of things that I think I want to jump off of, if that's okay. I'm not great at quoting pop culture, but I'm great at quoting the Bible.
Yes.
So number one, though, is like, it's not like you're condoning, any of the acts of violence.
No, of course not.
Really clear. Like, as I told you, complicate it, right? Make it complicated.
Yeah, complicated. Yeah.
Right. So that's good. Like when I look at these terrible acts of violence, I'm not trying to compare it to acts of violence that police do against people or people of color, or poor people, etc. Like, I don't want to just do a comparison, because that actually flattens both, and I don't want to do that. Right? So I look at that and not condoning it. I hate it, right? But I also see it as the outcome of all that trauma that you've been talking about, right? Christians are better at this than Jews about finding grace, right? You remember after Mother Emanuel?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course.
Right? So the perpetrators still have to be punished. Yeah. But they can be forgiven. Yeah. Which is different. And Christians are really good at this, or good Christians are really good at this in the way that Jews are not. And I've been trying to adopt some of that in my life. So I'm thinking about that. And then the second piece, and I'll get to the Bible in a second, is I keep thinking about who profits from utilizing these stereotypes to divide communities. So when an organization puts out a newsletter calling this the untold or unsaid pogrom, using that word, which will trigger Jews in a particular way,
Right.
what are they trying? What is their agenda in that? And how do they profit? Similarly, when they recast George Floyd as a Palestinian and the cop in Minneapolis as an Israeli soldier, what is their agenda in that?
Right.
What are they trying to do? And that's the thing that we always, I think, in addition to all the things you said, have to always be mindful of is there are people who will profit from this rage and this anger in ways that we don't necessarily totally understand and want us to be separate because they themselves become more powerful through that process. And whether it's on the right or the left or whatever, there are people who profit. And in some cases, media organizations that literally profit in millions of dollars from this. So they have a vested interest. So
this is ironically what Cornel West said on CNN.
Okay, well, Cornel West and I agree on a lot, and there's a whole bunch we don't. And I respect him for the stuff that I agree with, and viscerally disagree with the stuff that I disagree with him. Right? Same. So I can probably say that about a lot of people, and that's because I'm also not willing to flatten things out, as you said.
Yeah.
And then, so the last thing I want to say is, now here's the Bible quote. Right. The most important line in the Bible, according to Rabbi Akiva, is "V'ahavta re'ach kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. But you have to if you take the verse in its reverse, you can't love your neighbor until you love yourself. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, until you understand that you are capable of being loved and capable of loving yourself, then the basis of the golden rule actually begins with an open-mindedness that each of us are capable of being loved by someone else. And that we share that love within ourselves, and hopefully that fills ourselves up enough that we can love others, and it creates a virtuous cycle. So, Beyonce was right, Jay-Z was right, and Moshe Rabbeinu is right too in that sense, or Rabbi Moses was right too. And I just think about, that's one of the things I've been trying to really hold in this moment from a religious perspective, is how to hold all these tensions. And not allow myself to just let anger sort of well up. But I also, from a political organizing standpoint, that true gritty democracy allows us to have friends today and not enemies, but adversaries tomorrow, based on whatever we're working on. And that is where I think purity tests from progressives and purity tests for conservatives really, really endanger us as a community, because there's too many other interests at play that profit off of the purity test.
Very well said. Yeah, I also think that the play here on the part of some, in terms of who represent the powers that be, is to just divide and conquer. And that's why I tweeted a couple of days ago, the most revolutionary thing right now that you could do as an American is to refuse to hate your fellow American. Because there are really sinister forces in the country that profit, as you say, off of us hating each other. And so it is up to us to have the courage and the conviction to not do that, to refuse to do that.
Yeah.
And it's I don't want to minimize how hard it is, but what a beautiful discovery it is to recognize and to realize that you're capable of doing that.
Yeah, I think about, like, for example, in Tucson, Arizona, over the weekend, there was a protest like everywhere else. The curfew was being enforced. There were batons and shields and helmets, and they surrounded a group of young protesters, maybe about 30 of them, with a bunch of police all around. And the sun was going down, and the curfew was about to be enforced, and it was clear that they were moving in for a mass arrest. And one of the protesters, kind of as standoff for a minute, one of the protesters went up to squad leader or whatever and says, if everyone here takes a knee, we'll just go home right now. And it was like 10 minutes of intense negotiation. And you could see the body language of the cops kind of change a little bit.
Yeah.
And like one of them went down on a knee and another one went down on a knee.
Wow.
Soon enough, like majority of the cops went down on the knee. They prayed together.
Wow.
And then the protesters all went home. That group of protesters all left.
That's amazing. Can you send me that?
Yeah, my friend, one of my reverend friends sent me the video. I have to find it, but I'll send
Sure.
it to you.
Yeah.
And it's like, that sort of moment where it's like, I acknowledge your humanity enough, and I acknowledge your humanity through the shield, through the helmet.
Yeah.
That there is
I see you. I still see you.
I see you. I see a God-fearing or God-loving, or at least an enchanted human being in front of me, even if you're wearing helmets and armor. And I see you wearing a mask and a hoodie.
Yeah.
Behind that, there are eyes of a human being, and they're willing to just take a moment. And what could have been a really violent or potentially violent and sad moment became a moment of grace, which is like we just don't have enough of those.
100%. We need to bring that vocabulary word back. Yeah. We need to make that popular again. Grace.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of enchantment. I mean, I've been thinking about like we can create a theory of enchantment, which you've done so beautifully, but it's almost like a re-enchantment because you're born enchanted. You're born to hopefully. Most people. I mean, I want to believe.
Yeah.
You're born with a hopeful disposition, and it's only trauma that's the thing that beats it out of us.
Yeah.
It's almost like re-enchant, like a recovenanting.
Oh wow, I just got chills when you said that. Recovenanting.
Keep it, take it. There's no copyright on the Bible, so please don't.
Because I obviously understand, the depth of that context. It's interesting because I've noticed something. So like when God speaks to Moses, I wonder what you think about this. When God speaks to Moses, one of the things God says is, I have called you by name. And I think that's so interesting and so powerful. And there's something there. I don't know what, but there's something there because I teach Moana in the Theory of Enchantment course. And one of the most beautiful moments is when Moana realizes that the villain of the story is actually basically super traumatized. And she says, I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. And there's something deeply personal and gracious about that. And so I'm gonna contemplate that for the next, days, months ahead. So
maybe we'll bring it down to this. I mean, one of my favorite parts of Holocaust Memorial Day, and I try to participate every year, is reading names of victims.
Mm-hmm. Right?
Because we're trying to humanize them.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite parts of these protests and what's her name song, of course I can't remember the name of the artist, but is to say the names of all the victims.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from the same place.
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so saying the name.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Or Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin. Those are important names. Just like the names of the victims of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think about that we have there's just so much more potential inside each and every one of us.
So much more. I have seen it, and I'm sure you have seen it in the work that you do. I mentioned to you, I volunteer at this organization called Children of Promise in Bed-Stuy, which mentors kids whose parents are incarcerated. And I have seen it. Yeah. I've seen it through the stories that I get to tell because of they're embedded in the Theory of Enchantment course. I have seen neo-Nazis disavow their ties to white nationalist movements because a guy named Daryl Davis decided just to talk, to just engage. And I'm just going to talk to you. And I'm going to talk to you. Maybe I'll even talk to you for 20 years if that's what it takes. And in the process, one by one, I'm going to get over 200 of you to give up your robes. I've seen the filmmaker Dia Khan do this, right, with white nationalists as well. I have seen an entire country called Rwanda reconcile itself to itself because the leader of that country had the foresight and the spiritual wisdom to say, we are going to embark upon a program where those of you who brutally murdered your neighbors, you're going to engage in the process of restorative justice. We're going to do this together. You're going to go to the people, the family members of those whose lives you destroyed, and you're going to ask for forgiveness. And that's it. They don't have to give you forgiveness. You're not entitled to it. But we're gonna do that as a society. We're gonna dedicate ourselves to doing that. And you know what happened was crazy, because after thousands of people did this, what ended up happening was, in many cases, the folks who they harmed decided not only to forgive them, but to adopt them as their own children. That is the measure of grace that we are capable of as a human species of doling out to one another. We often talk about the brutality that we're capable of unleashing, but we don't nearly talk about the incredible amount of love and grace that we're capable of really extending toward one another enough. And I think that that's part of my task. That's my role in this moment that we're living through.
So to flip the Michael Jordan quote on its head, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't be afraid of what we might become. We should only be afraid of what we won't become.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be afraid of our capacity for love and grace, and that human beings are equally capable of violence, but they're
exactly
incredibly capable of love. And what we should be afraid of is that dark part inside of us that
takes over.
Evil inclination. Yeah. Maybe I'll end on a rabbinic story.
Sure.
When God wanted to create human beings, or thinking about creating human beings, if you know in the Torah, it actually says, let us create human beings in our image. It actually says it in the plural. And so the rabbis were like, well, who the heck was God talking to? Because, isn't God just God, right? And so they say, well, the angels were there. And God set up a debate club. He's like, should we create human beings?
Mm-hmm.
And like the angel of truth comes forward and says, absolutely not. Human beings lie all the time. They're terrible people, right? Mm-hmm. But then the angel of which one was it? The angel of virtue comes forward and says, well, human beings are so capable of so much more, right? And then another angel comes and says, the angel of peace says, human beings are just full of war. They're just they'll never achieve peace, right?
Yeah.
And then fourth angel comes and says, human beings are so much capable of building and of wisdom and so God's listening to this, and they're getting into this big argument, right? Mm-hmm. And God kind of like shuts them up. And by the time they're done arguing, human beings had already been created. And God's like, whoop, sorry. And that's because inside each and every one of us is the potential to hurt and to harm, and also to love and to hold, to have a sense of smallness and a sense of bigness. Mm-hmm. And this is the moment where this is one of those moments where societies have to decide, as we take this turn on the mortal coil of, are we going to be small? Are we going to be big? Are we going to be hateful and violent? Or are we going to be loving and cherishing each other? And, and I just say, I want to just put it out there again, because I think your theory of enchantment is so powerful. Because it's also not overtly religious, which is good, and it speaks to a lot of people, is that there are just so many other forces at play that will benefit from the hatred and benefit from the animosity towards, let's say, Black people and Jewish people, just to give an example, that we have to be really mindful of that. Like, why do I want to pay someone money to make me hate more? All right? Or why do I want advertisers to pay money?
Yeah.
So I hate more, right? Or why do I want to just decry terrible things that happen to parts of my community in order to do what exactly?
Mm-hmm.
Other than what I think you and I try to do, and I think what Zionist is trying to do in the progressive Zionist space,
Mm-hmm.
is to develop relationships.
Yeah.
To say, I'm going to show up for you without asking you to show up for me,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you'll show up for me when you're ready.
Bingo.
Right? And then that's it. Chloe, thank you for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
I hope you stay safe out there.
I'll do
I'm
my
glad you're out
best.
there doing it, but I hope you stay safe.
I'll do my best. And you as well. You as well, Noah.
And let's talk again. I'd love to have you back on. And, if you're ever out in LA, you come and give a talk and talk to
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
I might quote Kendrick from the Bema though, just FYI.
I'm cool with that. It'd be better if you got Kendrick to come with you to the Bema.
Well, baby steps, Noah. All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining me today on the Sunday Schmooze. I know I had to record it previously, but I hope you would join us next week. As I think Dr. Nick Holton is joining me next week, who is a positive psychologist, and we're going to be talking about positive psychology. So thanks everyone. And thanks to Chloe for joining us today, and hope everyone have a great day.